Very much for coming out tonight for this public meeting on branded content with the title, Is There Anything Wrong? So we have a loaded leading question that there just might be, and we want to explore it. And I'm delighted that to help us we have what in my opinion are three of the leading scholars investigating branded content in the United States here with us today, all of whom are speakers at an academic conference taking place tomorrow. But it's very much a commitment on our part, and this is a meeting organised by the Branded Content Research Network, to raise issues that face outwards to the public and to try to engage them. So that's why we've brought everyone over to Stratford and invited you along to this open public meeting. I suppose one of the reasons we've called this meeting is to say that perhaps we need some new rules for the game, because those settled limits that society has placed to regulate advertising are not extending and functioning in the new digital spaces that are being created. So a concern fundamentally about the spread and extension of marketers' voice. I've got an example, but it'll only work to half the audience, but I will try it anyway, because I used this at a recent talk I gave. In a regional newspaper published in Birmingham in this country was a story, an advertorial called Why Handsworth Grammar School Has Been Rated Outstanding.
What I would like to do, because I don't have prepared notes for this, is to talk a little bit about how I came to write Black Ops advertising and what has happened in the last couple of years since that happened. So I'm going to give you a little preview about my conversation tomorrow, and you can decide whether or not you're interested in it. Come and see that. I also want to say that my background is in advertising and marketing. I have an MBA and a PhD, and so I've worked in advertising and marketing for almost 20 years before I became an academic. I know what it's like to be in the trenches and have to respond to client needs on a day-to-day basis and answer to making sure that their products get sold. I don't come to this work to attack marketers. I come to this work to find ways to do marketing better. And this is what's going on in the industry right now. So is there some way that we can make it work for all of us? And I want to thank Jonathan both for inviting me as well as putting this together, because these kinds of conversations aren't happening. They aren't happening in the United States, that's for sure. And one of my largest concerns was that what I was hearing from industry research was that you people all knew when you were engaging with branded content. But I would go around and present my findings in university settings, and students' jaws would drop to the ground. And when I saw, now this is 3-4 years ago maybe, and I would show the Red Bull ads, or the Red Bull where the guy's jumping out of the plane, right, and that's all of this sort of stuff. Well, everybody knows now that that's all Red Bull. Well, 4 years ago, nobody knew, right? And so as I began to see all this, I started saying, okay, no, there's got to be more understanding about what this thing is. So I spent 2 years going to conferences, interviewing marketers who were dealing with this. My favorite quote was, "You're an old-time marketer." That's what they said to me. And I said, yes, I am an old-time marketer. I don't remember who said it in I think it was you that said this morning. The new marketers are really interested in the sparkly, new, fun things to play with. And I kept saying, digital is a tactic. Digital isn't a strategy. And it's, right? Yes, I'm seeing people not right? Digital is a tactic, it's not a strategy. And they got so wrapped up in that they couldn't figure out where this fit in all of this. But to this point, why is broke Black Ops advertising and why the name? Because that's the question I get more than anything else. Why Black Ops advertising? Besides the fact that my husband came up with the name, which I thought was really good. Think about, most of you are marketers, right? Or you've taken marketing classes. We talk about objectives and strategies and tactics. We use very militaristic terms when we talk about marketing. When we are trying to reach an audience, they are the target, right? So the next realm of where to go with this then was to talk about marketing that has become unseen. So in the same way our military has become black ops, right? Hidden forms of militaristic tactics, so has advertising become surreptitious. And that's where the name of this came from. So I spent 2 years talking to people, 2 things that I really wanted to find out. What do people think native advertising is? Because there was no definition for it, and there really wasn't a definition for branded content. Native advertising is advertising that is indigenous to the space within which it exists. So you see this ad in your Facebook feed or your Twitter feed and so on, that's native advertising. It's also custom native advertising in places like the New York Times or the Washington Post or any of the other Fox, Slate, Talking Points Memo. They all use it, right? 90% of online publishers use native advertising. Branded content, alternatively, was defined to me as, and this was from talking to a large number of marketers, content that was created by the marketer, not the publisher, and had no sales message to it. There was no sales message attached. So the idea was, we're going to give you information, we're going to give you content, we're going to provide you with entertainment and information, but we're not going to try and sell you something, we'll give you the information, and if there's something interesting in this, when you're ready to buy the product, you'll come to us to buy it, because we've provided something to you. And in looking at this, my largest concern, this is something that Michelle is going to talk about, is the fact that people did not recognize that they were engaging with marketed content. And we, as consumers, engage with material differently depending upon what we know about the material. If you're going to look at an ad, you use different faculties than you would use if you were going to read an editorial in the New York Times. You look at it differently. And that is also part of my concern about this. Now, you might have also heard about the fact that we had an election in the United States last year. You might have heard about it. Might have heard about it. So one of the major questions that I had after this book came out, people kept talking to me about, isn't this fake news? Isn't native advertising fake news? And yeah, it kind of is, right? And what has happened is, as we've opened the door to break down this wall between church and state, and as the lines start to get blurred between editorial content and marketing content, people start to be more suspicious of the content they're reading in published works. And so it starts to erode the credibility of the publications. And research that has been done in the last year out of Penn State has said that it's not marketers that are hurt by this content, it's the publishers. So the more that this kind of blurred content starts to appeal in the publications, what begins to happen is that we start to trust the publications less. So when we hear this idea of fake news, fake news, fake news, fake news, we marketers could be contributing to this idea as well. One other concept that I'm dealing with, and I'll be talking about a bit tomorrow, is influencers. How many people here have heard of influencer networks? A couple of people. More people here than I've seen in other places. Influencer networks, I would say when I was doing the research for my book, most of the companies were companies that were corralling writers, right? Because they were worried about content. And what was happening was the people who had been reporters were suddenly becoming marketers. And because they had the ability to be able to write like journalists, they were very good at writing content that looked exactly like editorial content because they had been journalists. And companies like NewsCred and Contentedly had these large pools of thousands and thousands of writers who were available to write. The same thing is happening now in the influencer market. So what is happening instead is that you have these influencer networks who have thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of influencers who they are then using to connect to brands. And what's interesting in that is it's not that just that the influencer is becoming the conduit for the information, but the influencer is the message. The influencer becomes the message because the influencer becomes the one who starts to create the content. And so that too is starting to have an effect in terms of who do we trust, who do we believe, who do we want to follow, and what information is real and what information is not real. And all of this, whether we're talking about the content or we're talking about the influencer, begs for regulation of some sort. And what you may or may not know is in the last week, the Senate had all of the social media owners in front of the Senate talking about the fact of political advertising and how political ads had influenced the election in the United States last year. Offline, those ads are required, or in so-called legacy media, those ads are required to be labeled as political advertising. There is no requirement for political advertising in the online space. What I would argue is that it's not enough just for political advertising to be labeled, but all advertising needs to be labeled. And I'll end it there. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much indeed.